Okay, so let's get started. So I'm Rogan Creswick. This is Benjamin Jones from Galois, and we're talking about open sourcing UI tests to help improve testing and generally for the common good. So I'd like to start out with this quote about UI consistency. Namely, consistency in user interfaces follows the second law of thermodynamics. To wit, a user interface left untended with no external forces during its course of development will tend towards inconsistency. So something needs to be done about this because consistency in user interfaces has been widely touted as a major factor in usability. Obviously that ties to profits in a lot of industries. And it's growing to be a bigger and a bigger deal as many more people contribute to user interfaces and tools. So we can all think of many websites, many interfaces where this is the case. So with a bit of experimentation, with any software tool, you'll find that consistency is indeed tending in the wrong direction. So when we think about consistency, there are a lot of different aspects. Visual consistency, consistency of terminology, different types of consistency across pages. The list kind of goes on and on. Interaction, consistency with user expectations. So there are a lot of things we need to be careful about. I'll let Ben go into that.
Yeah, so there are all these issues, and there are lots of different venues to think about, contexts to think about these issues in. So we could be talking about programs, we could be talking about web pages, we could be talking about kiosks, manuals, whatever. So, and there are a lot of people who have put a lot of thought, a lot of smart people who put a lot of thought and effort into trying to define what consistency means in particular contexts. So even doing casual searches on the internet, you find all kinds of things like style guides. So for example, the AP style guide. There are tons of user communities centered around different kinds of products and services that have developed their own style guides. For example, there are commercial style guides like the Apple App Store. Windows has its own style guide, multiple ones. And these talk about style, but also user interface and user experience all wrapped up into one. And many of these are very, very, very comprehensive, very large. The Windows user interface guide is over 600 pages long, for example. The Apple, the Apple, not the iOS human interface guideline, but the OS X human interface guideline is 300 plus pages long. So you can imagine trying to read through that as you're developing your application, right? Who's going to do that? So we have a short list of long lists, so to speak. So there's all this information, all this thought and energy have gone into developing guidelines, and how do you sort of implement, how do you enforce, how do you test, check the guidelines? So there's all this information, but how do you act on it? What do you do? There are also a lot of things that are sort of just too obvious not even to be written down, right? So this is an example of a pretty interesting piece of software that detects layout bugs in pages, right? So if you're looking at a web page and you see this, the text overflowing the boundary of the box there, you're like, yeah, that's wrong, but no one should have to tell you that that's wrong. And in fact, if you look through the style guidelines, there's no mention of things like this. It's just too obvious. There are all kinds of things like that that are just too obvious to mention, but they're important, right? And especially when you talk about like dynamically or machine-generated content, right? Machines probably don't know that that's wrong, that that's bad. So back to Rogan.
So in essence, there are many different efforts that are kind of getting at the same sort of thing. So the codified guidelines that Ben spoke about often even state the same thing, just even in the same words to an extent. So usability.gov and the Apple guidelines, for instance, both make the same recommendations about selection lists. So we really all want the same thing. We want essentially easier to use interfaces, and tools that we can use without as much training, just more intuitive systems. This goes for both developers and users. But we aren't working together. So there's very little effort to kind of combine our efforts aside from the extensive documentation of what we'd like. There's not a lot in the way of tools to help us make sure that what we've done actually matches what we want. So this quote, I think, really poses a good question. So wouldn't you think by now we'd have design and content tools which would make it easy or automatic to follow these standards? So I've been wondering this question for a while, and that's actually the question which prompted the work that we're talking about. So,
And by the way, this quote is from 2008.
So the tool we're talking about is FiveUI. So it really is just a tool for sharing tests. It provides a framework specifically for doing web testing, but all it is a framework for sharing those tests, a framework for running those tests, and a framework for analyzing the results. So it doesn't mean that you can't use the existing testing frameworks for the various languages available, but now there's a way to integrate them. There's a tool to help automate the process of ensuring these guidelines. So it takes a number of forms. It's a browser extension for Firefox and Chrome, and it's also a console tool, so you can run it without any interaction. So if you're wondering about the name, we were inspired by HTML5 semantics, but you don't have to have those semantics to use the tool. It'll work just fine with HTML4 or legacy versions of HTML. It analyzes the DOM, so it takes a kind of a standard approach to analyzing interfaces, which we think will be very familiar to basically any web developer.